here. Welcome to In Their Words, Using Departmental Data to Drive WAC. I'm Pamela Flash. I'm here. I have the great good fortune to be here with my colleagues and friends, Matt Luskey and Dan Emery. We are three members of the WAC team at the University of Minnesota. Minnesota is a large public R1 university, approximately 45,000 students. And the University of Minnesota is a land-grant institution located on ancestral lands of the Dakota people. So I'm just providing you with some context as we're opening. The data we're going to be talking about with you today emerge from our Writing Enriched Curriculum program. Some of you will be more familiar already than others with the WEC approach. WEC is a flexible department-located model that supports the integration of relevant writing and writing instruction into undergraduate curricula. So not only looking at the way that writing works in individual atomized courses, but the way that it works within curricular systems. And we work towards this integration by partnering closely with undergraduate departments. And we work with them to develop, implement, and assess what we call faculty-generated undergraduate writing plans. And these writing plans are worked through a kind of creation, revision, implementation, and assessment sequence over a series of almost 7 to 10 years is really what we're looking at this point. So we began developing the WEC model in 2006, and now we're 15 years later, and we have 65 departments and programs that are engaged in the process. And if you have more questions about the WEC approach, I'm happy to answer them later, between sessions, anytime. Feel free to email me about that. So what we're doing here is kind of laying out some of the context before we dive in. We want to think with you about some of the data we collect, and here is the skeletal structure that we're thinking about for this session. I'm going to start out by giving a little bit more of an overview of some of the data points we collect and when in the WEC process we engage faculty in their discussion. Then each of us, Matt and Dan and I, are going to give micro talks that zoom in on just one aspect, one data point, and really how we work with that and what we've learned. So what the data are, why we collect them, how we engage faculty with them, and what we've learned in the process of doing so. Then at the end, we'll have some final thoughts. We'll have some questions. We'll invite you to think further with us. And in between each of these micro talks, we're going to invite you to take a look at some specific data that we show faculty to really think about what you're seeing, to notice some of the patterns that you may be seeing in the data, what you're observing, what they're saying to you. And you'll be typing your observations into the chat. So in this way, the goal for this session is to provide you with an opportunity to observe these methods for engaging departmental faculty in a data-driven discussions that can have and have had some transformative effect on the ways that faculty go about integrating relevant writing, not only into their specific courses, but into their curricular systems. So that is our goal. The ways that we work with data and work with faculty over these 7 to 10 years looks broadly like this. Faculty within a department elect to be part of the WEC program. And when they elect to be part of the program, we start gathering data immediately before even the process gets going and gets interactive. The faculty then work together, and we work with them within their departmental context to develop what we call a first edition writing plan. And we'll talk more about what a writing plan is. That writing plan then goes into a single year of implementation before it gets revised and goes back into implementation and assessment as a second and then ultimately third edition writing plan. This 7.5-year scope was our typical timeline for the many departments that were engaged, until we realized that some of these departments had been with us for a really long time. They had started in 2006, 2007, and inevitably they'd had some faculty turnover. The things in their curriculum may have changed, the departments might have merged. Certainly discourse has changed, pedagogy's changed. And so they needed to have something more happen to kind of re-up some of this writing activity, make sure that their writing plan was still relevant. So we developed a couple of years ago a part of our program called the Legacy Project, or the legacy arm of our operation. So let's just zoom in and look at what we collect during these different periods. All of these data collection processes and discussions, as I've said, enable faculty to generate what we call an undergraduate writing plan. We provide the outline for the plan. They provide the content for the plan. They provide this content in a series of conversations that we co-facilitate. And there are data brought to each of these meetings. So the rough outline of the writing plans that all of the 64 plus departments work with is like this. The first and second section are asking the faculty to really characterize writing first, initially, characterize writing broadly in their field. So in the academic applications of their field and in professional applications of their field, if that's germane to their discipline. The next section looks at writing abilities. So here they're answering the question, with what writing abilities should graduates, undergraduates, so seniors graduating in our majors, what writing abilities should they be able to demonstrate? So in discussing these two things and generating content for these parts of the writing plan, we bring two data points. We bring stakeholder surveys, which we'll be discussing, and we bring samples of student writing that we have gathered from undergraduate students at various points in the major. The third section of the writing plan says, essentially, if this is where we want students to exit, if these are the writing abilities we want them to exit with, how are we getting them there in the systems of our curriculum, in all of the courses, in the major, service courses, the whole collection of courses? And so to these meetings, we bring a series of curricular maps and matrices. And in some ways, these are some of the most exciting data that we bring, but they're a little complex. So we won't be focusing hard on those today. We're happy to talk about those at another time. The next section of the writing plan asks faculty how they translate their expectations, so their answers to question 2, into criteria, into a menu of criteria that they collectively, as a faculty, can adapt in their teaching. Not that they need to work with all of these abilities and translate all of them into criteria for their courses, but it creates a menu from which they can pick and choose. And so to this meeting, we bring their writing abilities, and they kind of create a cottage industry of translating these general abilities. This is what we want students to be able to do into valid criteria. And finally, the writing plan asks faculty essentially what they want to do. What has been kindled during these discussions? What things would they like to address? How can they optimize students' chances of graduating able to demonstrate these writing abilities that faculty value and expect? So to this meeting, we bring forth a lot of the ideas that have come up in the other meetings. These meetings take place over the course of a year. So there are lots of ideas that have been triggered and generated. And so we ask them to weigh in and really kind of vote with their nod which things they would like to be actually participating in as they move forward. So to the first stage of their engagement with WAC, we collect these different kinds of data, undergraduate writing samples, these stakeholder surveys, these curricular maps and matrices. We audio record all meetings and we transcribe them. We bring some of that transcription back to faculty for them to examine. The writing plans that result in and of themselves are data points, so they're a form of data that faculty are working with. And then beginning the first year that a writing plan has been completed and approved, We work with direct assessment, where we assemble panels of raters who rate capstone level writing or senior level writing against faculty articulated criteria. So these are the data that faculty are interacting with at the beginning. As we move forward in the second and third editions of the writing plan, some of these same things come back, but they are altered, they get tweaked, they get revised, they get updated. When we get into the legacy program, for those who are working in the legacy part of the process, we bring back some updates on some of these data points. We deepen our relationship with the department. So we're working with different kinds of samples. We're working with different kinds of surveys at that point. And Dan in his talk is going to be talking you through some of that. So these are the ways that we bring data to faculty within their departmental meetings. This is what we collect. This is when we interact with them. This is when they engage these data. So that's my foregrounding of the data points that we collect. We can't work in this session with all of them. I'm going to start my micro talk really by focusing on two specific data points that we work with in all departments when they're starting. And what my supposition here is, or my claim here is, that these data can launch and deepen departmental discussions about writing. So here's how we think about that. The first data point that we work with are these stakeholder surveys that I've been mentioning. These stakeholder surveys are completed by all students in the majors. So when a department signs up, we get to work with all of the students in their major. We get their contact information. We find out where they are. All faculty members, instructors, whether these are TAs, tenure track faculty, sometimes people bring emeritus faculty into the process, visiting instructors, whoever's teaching are another population. And then where relevant, a population called professional affiliates. The professional affiliates or external affiliates are people outside the university, but inside the discipline. So they may have professional applications of the discipline. And I'll show you some examples of that. So there are three populations, three surveys that are quite parallel, but not exactly the same. Each of these surveys asks the survey takers to describe writing in their discipline, and then also to really assess themselves as writers, to assess the efficacy of the writing instruction that they have or that they've been giving so far. For the professionals to assess the entry-level writing, field-specific writing that students have been doing. Arguably, the most important question that we work with is where we're asking students and faculty and professional affiliates to describe what they consider critical writing abilities within their field. We ask them a little bit differently. So when I say these are quite parallel, but not exactly, you can see that here. We're asking students to name the writing abilities that faculty in their major seem to be expecting them to demonstrate. So what kinds of things describe the writing you're doing in this major? And we ask faculty to articulate which writing abilities students should be demonstrating by the time they graduate. Affiliates, we ask, which writing abilities would you expect entry-level employees to demonstrate proficiently in your field, right? So in this way, we are working with a generic list of writing abilities. We started out in the early days when I first started this, I thought this could just be wide open and we could just code their data. Ultimately, what we found out was that by providing this generic list with an open element at the end, we were getting a running start on this idea that writing moved beyond citation formatting or proofreading or punctuation or grammatical features, and moved people quickly into recognizing that when we're asking about writing, we're asking about the ways in which discipline relevant thinking is demonstrated in these different discourses and languages. So these verbs that you see on this generic list are what they're responding to. Right, so this is their choice bank when they first start. as they move through the process in the many years that we work with them, they move away gradually from this list. It becomes much more customized. It becomes much more germane to their department, right? So we talk about department specific or department relevant rather than discipline relevant, because the departments have different interpretations of discipline relevant discourses. All right, so that we use these surveys, we bring them to faculty, we juxtapose the population, so we get the data back, and we work with juxtaposing the three stakeholder populations in ways that we think might be provocative to discussion. And I should say that in each of the departments we work with, there's a faculty member we work with called a liaison who really does liaise. They are the inside players. They work with these surveys. They help make sure that the surveys have a good response rate. They also help us really make sure that the data that we're providing back to faculty are not obvious, that they're going to be productive data points to bring back to the faculty. So I want to take a look with you at an example or a case study. In this case, we're going to look at the three stakeholder populations and their responses to this abilities question from earth sciences. Earth sciences in some institutions is geology, geophysics. These are all under the umbrella of earth sciences. So when we asked earth sciences majors, students, to indicate which of these writing abilities they thought they were being asked most critically to demonstrate, these were the three. We asked about the three top most critical writing abilities. And you can see that there's a tie. So we have four of them here. This is what students said they thought were most critical to their courses in earth sciences. Then, when we juxtapose this with faculty, this is how faculty add to student responses. And then, this is when we add professional affiliates, this is what they add to the conversation. When we bring these slides to, in this case, the earth sciences faculty, we didn't need to do a lot of talking. We didn't need to say, I'll draw your attention to some of these differences or some of these patterns. They were immediately interested in the ways in which these populations saw these writing abilities differently. And they began to discuss, well, why is this? Our job as facilitators, Matt, Dan, and I, when we work with departments, is really to try to do what we can to engender that conversation. A lot of what we do is simply bring these data to them. We are organizing them in ways that we think are productive, but we are not interpreting these data for them. All right, so this is an example where I think it's fairly clear that for some reason, students are valuing or thinking that their faculty are valuing a different set of abilities from those that are indicated by their faculty and indicated by the professional affiliates. In this case, the professional affiliates were people like geophysicists, people who were environmental consultants on mining sites, people who work in water legislation. These were the professional affiliates, people who work in the field but outside the academy. So after they'd seen these, the faculty members in earth sciences got into a discussion pretty quickly. This is a part of the transcript from the tape. They were very interested in this point down at the bottom here. Visuals. It's like, oh, we didn't identify that. And students didn't identify that, but we should have, right? Because that's something that we do. Oh yeah, visuals are writing. So, oh yeah, visuals. Do we teach them that? We want them to be able to explain in words the meaning of data and figures. Really? They should summarize. Wait. They should synthesize. So here's where they're kind of surfacing some of their tacit assumptions. That's right. They should know how to do this. And they should know how to do some of this word stuff that goes on in captions, right? So this is ultimately a conversation that in their writing plan made its way into that section 4, that assessment piece, where the faculty, through a process of more discussion, were beginning to figure out how they wanted to name these abilities in ways that they could use to assess them. So what criteria could be extrapolated from these values around visuals? This is just one piece of their writing plan, one part of their list of criteria, but it pertains to these ideas of working with data, working with synthesis, working with those labels. And they told us that this was transformative to the ways that they worked with writing, not only in how they defined writing, but in making clear to students what their expectations were, rather than kind of bundling them into what equals a good piece of writing in earth sciences. So why do we do this? Why do we collect these particular data? For a variety of reasons. Part of it is to locate the faculty in these meetings even further in their context. We're in their building, we're in their department meeting, and we want to remind them that this is not about writing in general. This is about writing in earth sciences in this case, to break away from generic good writing, bad writing, generic expectations of writing. We also want to be inclusive of perspectives of relevant stakeholders. Students aren't at this meeting. This is a way for them to bring their concerns and their perspectives to the meeting. External people who hire people who are graduating or who advise internships, et cetera, aren't in the meetings. We want to make sure we bring their perspectives. We want to make sure that these discussions are relevant. We want to make sure that we're working with a capacious definition of writing and writing instruction and text that integrates with local learning, thinking, concepts, discourses. And we want to make sure that the agency is on faculty. We take an inductive role in these meetings. We want to make sure that the faculty feel that they are involved and in charge of this effort, and working with these data where they're interpreting them, we're not interpreting them for them, helps them feel that, oh yeah, you're not just saying this is faculty driven, this is really turning out to be faculty driven. We also want to make sure that we are processing, we're moving beyond attitude. Kids can't write today, their phones are ruining their writing, somebody else should have been teaching them writing, moving beyond some of these attitudes and truly getting into the nitty gritty of what they're expecting with writing. And finally, we bring these data to establish a baseline. We're with these people for a long time. We're with them in a heavy duty way for 7+ years, but we keep assessing them every 3 years to perpetuity. So we want to establish some baseline data so that they can begin to see how things have changed over the years, right? What have we learned by working with these data? In essence, we've learned that these goals that we have for working with data do work, that the reasons why we use them have been borne out. So working with data in these ways allow the faculty to focus on these data, allow us to use inductive facilitation, which provokes the surfacing of these tacit or unchallenged ideas, which allow us to move and help the faculty move beyond some of the things that can really roadblock the integration of writing and writing instruction into their curriculum. We've seen that the ideas that are germinating in these meetings make their way into writing plans, make their way into writing assignments, make their way into writing assessments. Finally, we see that the value of these facilitated discussions is noticed by faculty. They get it. And so Matt helped coordinate a fairly comprehensive focus group assessment. And here are some of the things that liaisons and faculty members had to say to us in these focus groups.
I just don't think you're going to find 5 people on this campus that don't think that students need to be better writers. But this gives you the opportunity to think, well, what does that mean? Creating that space for the discussion is really, really important because everyone gets pulled in 1,000 different directions.
Dan, you're muted.
Damn it. The process was very helpful for our entire department to articulate understandings that we all shared, but had never really been voiced or articulated in a general way. And I think we discovered that our discipline is so closely linked to writing, not simply to just communicating findings.
Great, thanks. And here's finally, I feel like for the sustainability of WAC in our department, we're deciding, do we keep having these meetings and keep talking to each other? Or do we just say, here's the 10 things, use this program. The things that make WEC difficult and a little precarious is the constant conversation and the grassroots people talking to people. But I think that sustains WEC at a different kind of quality level. So we see these comments as affirmation that the faculty really understand what we're up to with this process. And so with that, I want to invite you all, after this kind of rapid fire look at how these data work, I want to invite you to have a look at some of these data. And so you're going to review the chart below as a member of the architecture faculty. So here's your chance to be members of the architecture faculty. You might not have known this was in your daily agenda, but this is what we're up to. And so I'm just going to ask you, instead of 5 minutes, just 2 minutes of making some observations here. Anything that occurs to you, which 3 writing abilities are most important in this major? This is similar to the earth sciences chart that I showed you. Feel free, just as we're moving over to think with Matt about his part, to make any observations. If you were a member of this faculty, what would be some of the things that you notice in these data?
And while you're doing that, I'm going to briefly switch the screen share. So this will pop back on in a second.
Great, some great observations coming through. Yeah. Great, thanks. And for the sake of time, thank you for working with us on this. I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Yes, thank you. Pamela's given you a succinct overview. It's a quick one. We're going to share our slide deck PDF after the session. We promise you'll have access to this. What I'd like to briefly do is speak with you about a particular part of the data that Pamela gave an overview, and that is the student data, which really consists of 2 key sources. The responses to the surveys that Pamela talked about, and she shared an example of a question that appears on the 3 stakeholder surveys. The questions on this side in blue are a selection of the kinds of questions we specifically ask students. And there's some quantitative responses and there are some qualitative open responses. So there's a lot of rich data that comes out of the student responses here. We also use student writing samples, redacted writing samples, and we work very closely with the WEC liaison in selecting these samples before we go into the WEC meetings. And samples are useful at the departmental level, certainly, for doing the work that Pamela described, but they're also useful for assessments that we do every 3 years with the department. We use redacted student samples in WAC workshops with faculty and instructors. It's safe to say that student words infuse everything that we do. And so it's really valuable that we work with student data. And one thing that we can't do is bring the students physically into the WEC meetings. It's a space for faculty and graduate instructors to be candid and to explore it. And so undergraduate students aren't in the room, or in the more recent history on the Zoom. And so what we do is the student responses and the student writing samples are a way of bringing them into that WEC meeting. It's very vital that they participate in it. And we collect these samples carefully and we bring them in. And one of the most rewarding and interesting aspects of preparing to meet with faculty is to read through the student responses. Faculty receive reports of the student responses, or redacted references to specific courses, etc. But when we read through this in preparation for preparing the materials that Pamela shared, we often see that these responses are full of conceptual uncertainty alongside key intellectual breakthroughs as students share their varied writing experiences in the major. We learn a lot about what assignments were most meaningful to them. So Michelle's work, I think, is sort of reinforced by the survey. Their prior experiences with writing at the university, and their self-assessment of themselves as writers. There's lots of rich data that comes out of the student responses. And what I'd like to do with you briefly is to think with you about how we use it in a particular instance, the typical way that we would work with student data and faculty, and then to think about the larger patterns that student data is starting to suggest to us. And we're interested in working with the descriptive patterns when we start to aggregate the student response data. Pamela talked about the importance of the rare opportunity for faculty to gather together, especially at an R1 school, to talk about undergraduate writing without the intent of grading it. And that's really an important dimension of this. This is rare, and as that one person in the focus group indicated, it doesn't happen often. So it's really valuable that they get a chance to work directly with student writing. What you
Matt,
see,
do you want me to share my slides?
Pardon me?
You're not sharing? Do you want me to share slides in advance for you? I think
I thought they were. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Which slide are you on?
Good interrupting you.
Are you not able to see the slide deck? Try one more time. Are you able to see it?
We're golden.
Okay, that was my prologue here. Empty seat, sample questions. You'll see this in the slide deck. This is a typical way in which we will bring the data forward to faculty in a meeting. So on the left here, you'll see excerpts of writing samples, redacted samples. And when faculty have a chance to sort of look at the samples in hand, they can get very concrete about what it is that they are noticing and what it is that their real learning aims and intentions are with student writing. On the right side, you'll see a slide that puts some of those student responses in conversation with other stakeholders. And as Pamela said, we're not there to sort of reach a predetermined end. We're there to sort of let them talk through this data. So this is a typical way, with economics being the example, of how this data gets put in front of faculty. And what you often see, let me back it up one more slide, is that during that rich moment when faculty are talking about student writing, you start to see emerging here what I think Pamela described as making concrete, making explicit what may have been tacit initially. And this is an excerpt from a transcript with the econ faculty and graduate students. The graduate students have a very large teaching role with undergraduates at our department, so they were very central to this process. And some of the language that you'll see here with the instructors and the professor is language that gets honed, as Pamela was describing, into the writing plan. So some of the language of wanting students to be able to learn the process, to be aware of how assumptions work, to think about what might be an appropriate model. That language is what you'll see in the writing plan with the desired writing abilities of faculty. And it's grounded and substantiated by their work with these student samples. So that's the way we do our WAC work. It's really departmentally based and in-house. And we rarely get to sort of uncloak ourselves and get sort of and think in aggregate ways about it. But we wanted to look at some of the patterns in the student response data and to think with you about some of the trends that we're seeing in this. And we invite you to see, to share, if you're gathering samples from your students, if some of this resonates with what's happening at your campus. And there are really two findings we want to put forward when we look at a large sample of student responses. The samples that we're going to share some data with you are from an 8-year period, 2013 to 2020. That is about half of our WAC period of time. 24 units started the WAC process with us during this. There are over 2,000 student responses, about a 37% response rate to the invitation. So those are sort of the ends and the details of it. And two findings at a descriptive level that we see is that across the colleges and disciplines, students recognize the importance of writing to success in their major and their future professional work. And they see writing as the primary tool for developing and demonstrating thinking. And that's something that really comes through in the open response section that Pamela mentioned. A second finding is we asked them about their first year writing experiences. Many of them satisfy a first year writing experience before they come to the university. So it's not about assessing our particular first year writing program only, it's about their prior experiences with first year writing. And an interesting pattern there is that a majority of students find the work they did in that first year writing course or its equivalent to be relevant to the writing that they're doing in the major. And so those are the 2 points I want to share with you. This first is sort of a big picture here of the way that students are identifying the importance of writing. And in some ways it's, I think, perhaps obvious, but what's really valuable is, you know, we could share this with the folks that are supporting undergraduate writing initiatives and support for writing centers on campus. It's clear across our disciplines that writing is of value. It's identified as extremely important or very important. This next slide here is sort of breaks this out by the units that we work with here. So you can see, you know, STEM fields, social sciences, humanities. There's a range here, and the extreme and the very importance of writing, it comes through here, and even somewhat. There are a few disciplines where some of the students thought it was not important, but those are really quite small in the student responses. So again, we invite you to use the chat if you have some questions or some observations that you're seeing here. If we turn to that second finding of the relevance of first year writing, there's really 2 dimensions to this. The first is how relevant do students perceive that first year writing experience to be, either at the U or before they came to the U, or satisfied through a senior year requirement. And here you see that there is some irrelevance, but again, 70% of our students see it as either extremely relevant or relevant. And I think that becomes very interesting when we look at it at departmental levels. We'll see that in some of our STEM fields, the perception of relevance decreases, but only in math is it more irrelevant than it is perceived as relevant. And that becomes quite interesting to think about, especially when we couple it with this last bit of information, which is when we ask them about their first year writing, we ask them to think about whether that first year writing experience addressed features of first year writing that are often part of the desired abilities that departments have. And you'll see here that almost all of them have a 70% identification that they have worked with this concept of writing and action. And one, you know, it's sort of self-reported data. We understand that, but one thing that I think is really comes through here and resonates with what Chris Tice talked about in his plenary yesterday is that we know in our work with our colleagues that there are times that deficit-oriented language sort of kind of emerges. You know, the students can't, students haven't, students, what have they learned? They haven't learned, and that sort of downriver blaming that happens. This data is interesting for speaking back to that students have identified themselves as having encountered these before. 90% feel like they have been addressed what thesis is, but they're still working through that. And I think this is a really important and empathetic piece of data here to bring forward, that students do have writing histories, they do have writing experiences in past, and sometimes those histories get smudged out and erased or diminished in ways, and students believe they have come a long way. And I think we have to sort of remind ourselves that that's a really important perspective to bring forward with our work with faculty. Okay, I'm trying to catch us up here on this. I'd like to, as we're transitioning over to Dan, is to invite you to take a look at a response from an open response from our student survey. This is from a student studying economics. Pamela is going to read this passage, and then we'll give you a minute or so just to use the chat to have top of mind observations.
I think most of the emphasis is placed upon figures or diagrams that demonstrate course content. Beyond these, however, I don't think much, if any, emphasis is placed on written communication of such ideas. I found this an intimidating barrier to entry in the language and presentation in professional literature whenever I've needed to reference resources, which brilliantly sabotages my confidence of ever completing the assignment that required their use in the first place. I understand that I'm not the likely target audience for the literature, and instead it's probably meant for real economists. This leads me to my last point about writing in economics. It has been implied, if not explicitly stated, that the writing we do should be a contribution to the field. Personally, this seems impossible.
And Dan, do you want to take over? Thank you for the rich top of mind observations. Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. I even remembered to unmute. One of the fun things that we've been working on as a WEC team is all three of us have been involved in a lot of Zoom meetings, and we've been working on these really cool transitions between the three of us. And I'm always the one who forgets to unmute. So I'm happy to have continued that string. So what I'll talk about in this last part of the presentation is another dimension of the work that we've developed just over the last 3 years, as Pamela mentioned, the WEC Legacy Project. In its first instantiation, and this was 2006, 2007, before Matt and I came along, the plan was that departments would enter and exit the WEC program after about 7 years, which is a really extraordinary opportunity as you think about it for sustained development over time. But the plan was that as new units came aboard, we would have to do something, or Pamela would have to do something in order to afford opportunities to onboard new units. And as we've moved, we're now within 45 different departments, colleges, and cross-curricular programs. We have had that train keep moving. So we've had the focus on the active writing plans of many of our groups. And the WEC Legacy Project really emerged out of a felt need among some of our early adopters to re-engage these conversations after 3 cycles of direct assessment and after 3 writing plans. So we created this WEC Legacy Project. We decided that it would be voluntary, just like it always has been, but also competitive. So we would only select a couple of units per, because we're still continuing to onboard new units, like animal science came aboard this year. But we developed a plan to ask folks to apply, to provide a justification why they'd like to renew in this process. And then that activated a series of data gathering steps. So we continued to gather undergraduate writing samples, but the component that I'll talk about here is our faculty, student, and affiliate surveys. The motivations for why it was that folks wanted to become involved were different. In the case of 3 of the units who came aboard, they remained relatively consistent. They had changes, of course, in the student population. They added faculty and other faculty left. But mechanical engineering history and art history, 3 of the units that we worked with, were each a single department offering a single undergraduate major and maybe multiple undergraduate degree programs, but a single undergraduate major. 2 of the others were different. Design, housing, and apparel came on board very early, but it's broken into a variety of different areas. So graphic design, apparel design, retail merchandising, interior design were all involved in the beginning. Interior design moved out, but a new major, new product design, came on board through this process. And so there was a desire to sort of integrate this new dimension of this new curriculum, one that was very popular among students, to make sure that we had the opportunity to address them. Horticultural science was even more complex. Horticultural science, when it came on, was a department with an undergraduate major. Eventually, a companion department, agronomy and plant genetics, came on board. And both of those undergraduate majors eventually went away. They were replaced by two new majors, one called plant sciences that involved a lot of those courses, and a second called sustainable agriculture and food systems. So these departments had undergone some pretty significant change with all of the questions of politics and relationships that go along with those. So they were primed for a new opportunity to think about the kind of work that they were doing. The component I'm going to focus on right now are the faculty, student, and affiliate surveys. And of course, the faculty population, in most cases, there was turnover, right? So sometimes we would ask a question, were you involved in the initial process of data gathering? And we could, for 4 of the units, we could actually extrapolate that data. But so in some cases, we actually can compare attitudes and values of people who were on the faculty in 2007 or 8 with their perceptions right now. But student participants had turned over completely. So the attitudes and values that we're getting from students are not sort of something that shows change over time, but rather a new snapshot into these student populations. And I'll talk a little bit about that data. When it came to affiliates, because they're kind of an icing on the cake group, it's difficult to do comparison data, and we don't presume any continuity, but the information that we gather from them is really interesting. And we were able to ask some new questions of those affiliate populations that'll be really interesting. So this will be a rocket taster course in lots of the data that we collected, but I promise that I can talk further about them. One of the sort of big flashy findings, the one that I was most excited about, was when we look at the question, how important is writing to the scholarly and professional work of your field? We see some change over time in direct comparison. In fact, in the 4 units that chose to ask that question again, each of them saw what I call a change in the shape of the curve. So in mechanical engineering in 2008, many faculty considered writing to be very important. This was good news. It was 4 on a 5 scale. But by the time that we make it to 2019 and we're collecting data, about 60% of faculty identified writing is extremely important. And one of the things that was really delightful that went along with that is we can compare this data with the question of, do you feel students are competently performing as writers? And yeah, the precise question that we asked them is, how do you feel students are performing by and large? We can actually also see a positive shift in the case of mechanical engineering, where previously the majority of faculty said students were not meeting a standard of sufficiency. Now about 60% of them are. So really exciting data. And for the other 4 departments, we see things that are similar. The thing that made me pick Mechie as our example, though, was actually it relates to Brenda's question. Is, are students coming in with an idea that writing is important because they've had good high school education? Or is this something that we see as a change over time? And I'm not certain that we can make the claim that we see a change over time, but what I can say is that originally when we asked students, how important is writing to your discipline before any interventions, the majority of students, in fact, yeah, practically all of them said writing is moderately important to the field. With a new student population, again, first year, sophomore, juniors, and seniors several years later, we see more than 75% of students identified as extremely or very important. So what that says to me, that faculty are doing a good job of communicating to their students that writing is an extremely or very important part of the work that they do. And this is confirmed with a lot of other information that we get from the surveys. So that I think is the big shiny finding, is that we see increased belief that writing is an essential component of fields in units who are participating in this legacy study, even though we started the process 8 years before I was on campus and 12 years ago in this case. The second sort of set of really exciting stuff has to do with ways in which students and faculty report on changes in writing instruction. We have 3 quantitative measures, and they're based on questions that sort of ask, which of the following writing activities have you included in your class, or which of the following writing experiences have you experienced in your undergraduate courses? In the undergraduate courses that you've recently taught or taken, how often have you seen the following methods used? And then briefly describe one assignment in your major that you found particularly helpful, meaningful, helpful, or useful. We ask student and faculty variations of those questions, and we see sort of 3 quantitative findings that are all really good news. Types of writing assigned, and the frequency at which writing is assigned seems to increase pretty dramatically. There's a nice increase in the frequency of tasks that we describe as sort of deliberate writing instruction. So this includes things like faculty members sharing the criteria for assessment along with their assignments, or faculty members engaging students in the process of working upon multiple drafts. Then we also see an increase in what I'm calling here student supporting writing activities. These are the things that can include having a norming session with fellow TAs to make sure that there's a comprehensive standard across a department or across a unit. So a lot of the attention on the faculty development components of student writing are sort of described there, and students describe their experiences with those things like peer review, those things like receiving criteria and the like. The really interesting, and it's almost a quantitative measure, when we ask folks about the description of useful writing assignments, the number of folks who responded and the range of folks who responded really expanded. What we see in MECI is that about 60% of our original sample were using one of the writing activities that we identified. The sample set of faculty that we collected, 100% of them were using it. It isn't 100% of the faculty in total, so there's a convenience sample problem here. But we do see that there's increased activity in writing, and faculty are up to more with the writing that happens in their classes. Oops. The reason, of course, and I think the fundamental motivation for our activity in this was to re-engage our departments and make sure that we had sustained engagement with WAC. And for all 5 of the units we work with, we have now, even through the pandemic, units that are moving forward with new ideas about writing. So renewed attention to writing criteria in their undergraduate courses, the development of new and supplemental teaching materials, focusing on scaffolding writing in their early curriculum. For design, housing, and apparel, each of those discrete units now has its own set of characteristics, abilities, and criteria that they can use to guide their own curricular processes. And plant science both picked up some new criteria for the sustainable agriculture program, but also even in a time when 2 departments are negotiating ownership of the new plant science integrated major, they're really negotiating how it is that the values of the discipline are taught. And it's been a way to incorporate, because these are multidisciplinary units on campus, to incorporate a lot of potential new voices in these kinds of conversations. So what I want to give you here is just a little snippet, and this is again that opportunity for you to think about it, is an abbreviated faculty response on the importance of the identified writing character or abilities in mechanical engineering. And way in the early days, but long before I arrived, one of the premier activities that the faculty were involved in was the development of writing guides for problem sets, projects, and reports. When we gave all of the list of abilities to the mechanical engineers and asked which of these are important identified writing abilities in your area, this is the data that we got back. I'm so far behind in chat, I don't know that I'm ever going to get to the point where I can pick back up again. But yeah, I think you're seeing some of the things that we saw, that attention to audience, attention to sort of purpose and rhetoric start showing up as important to the faculty. Applying conceptual knowledge is the thing that showed up as the most important writing ability. That made me do a happy dance. To John's question, these weren't offered as a Likert. We simply gave folks a list and said, which of these items is important in writing in mechanical engineering? And we gave them their full list of abilities and full list of criteria. And what it did was, where previously when they generated abilities, they were all abilities were treated equally. This gives us a rank ordering of which of the abilities identified by the faculty previously matter most to the population of faculty who are present. And that leads to some interesting opportunities for conversation and discussion. And yes, Diane, yeah, the list there is generated from the criteria and abilities that faculty developed in their initial meetings. And for criteria in particular, because we tweak criteria after each round of direct assessment, all of that data is also included. And I'll turn it back to Pamela to be our final wrangler.
And we have like a minute and a half to be wrangled in. So we invite you, we gave you a really fast tour of some of the data that we collect, and we appreciate your willingness to kind of drink from our fire hose. We wanted to be able to show what some of these data look like both across and within the disciplines. So if there's one or two questions, we can take it now. I think I could speak for Matt and Dan. We're happy to stay around for a little bit and answer questions for a few minutes afterwards, if that's allowed. Otherwise, feel free to ping us through the Whova app or anything else. Are there questions? Diane, you want to know how we would change the process for non-majors. So we work within departments, and within the WAC discussions, we work both with the service courses and with courses in the major. So there may be, in working with the entire faculty and the entire collection of courses, there will be non-majors addressed there. We don't survey them, and the abilities that are articulated are for students in the majors. This is what we expect of students in our major. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. Feel free to unmic and let me know if I'm thinking about this wrong.
Yes. I would just really quickly echo that sometimes our departments are aware of that and they want to make that a point of focus. So history, for example, wanted to articulate writing abilities for majors, but they serve so many non-majors in their program that they were trying to think about those two populations in their courses.
Okay, so you still do it by department, but you let them determine if they want to address majors or non-majors. The reason I ask is that I work at a community college, and many of our students, most of our students, we're requiring them now to declare a field of interest. So we might be able to work through that path. But there are a lot of different fields in these fields of interest, so it may be a little messy. So that's just why I was asking. Thank you.
Yeah, and in some of our units, we have an entire college as a unit, or we have a very interdisciplinary major. And so we engage in some of these same conversations.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Sarah has a question.
Hi, yes, thank you. It's so great. And I think you've kind of blown my mind actually, but specifically by making what the work you do, like the discussions you have about what the department wants. Because I haven't really entered into any of that work myself, but I have fantasies of doing that at my university. And I've often been just thinking about, okay, here are the types of writing preferred in the disciplines, right? Here, like what professionals working in these disciplines do. So then it would be me coming in being like, the data I would imagine bringing, and now until now that I've seen this fabulous presentation would be like, here's what research has found about how people in the discipline write. But that is often a weird misfit with the particular personalities in a given department and the particular context that you have the institution. So the idea of doing it ground up from the department, and I like being about the department and kind of suppressing a little bit all of what you know about what the research might say about that department's disciplines plural. I think it's really brilliant.
Thank you.
Like at the start of your presentation, you were talking about that those sort of generic like skills that you may name as a way of prompting their thinking very early on. And at first I was like, but there would be research to say what are the specific skills in this discipline, but now I get it. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I've really come to learn that it really needs to come organically and working with samples of student writing and the surveys, helping people surface those expectations rather than working with a pre-articulated list. Yeah.
Yeah.
Deirdre, I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
Yeah. Pamela uses the metaphor of cloaking our sort of our own research background in awareness of it. And that's not always easy to do sometimes. A couple of questions that have come out about the sample selection. We work very closely with WAC liaisons in that process. There's also some questions about getting students to complete the surveys. When you have the slides and you cycle through them, you'll see that there's a little part about a $25 gift certificate. So we have enticements that we can to get students. Some departments, youth studies, actually had donuts next to a computer to get students to do that. But there is a process in the early fall when we are really trying to get students to complete that survey. And we're constantly, our colleague Heidi Solomonson is constantly providing the response rates, and we really try to get those rates up. So it's a sort of, it's an all hands on encouragement deck when students are in a 3-week period of taking the survey.
Yeah. And finally, to Deirdre, to your question about working in the graduate curriculum, there certainly has been interest in this. And many times when we're working with an entire faculty, there are people who teach at both levels and some who teach exclusively at the graduate level, and they say it's useful. Graduate curricula are often different from undergraduate curricula, and this idea of mapping the curriculum and thinking about who's doing what with specific writing abilities is a different kind of conversation in a graduate program. So we, as Dan said, we work through the Office of Undergraduate Education. I report to the Vice Provost, and so we have focused on this, but I think it would be a quite different discussion in many graduate fields, and some that are more professional. It may be corralled in ways and controlled in ways that are analogous to what we do in undergrad. But in many grad programs, it becomes idiosyncratic to different projects, working one-to-one with students and so forth.
It's a really interesting point of intersection because many of those graduate students are also instructors, and sometimes they're instructors working with assignments that faculty have designed, but sometimes they're also instructors of record. So as graduate students are developing as, apprenticing in their field, they're also learning things about how it is that writing in the field happens. And it's incredibly common to hear in the process of our rating, like, students are performing only okay on this very advanced technical skill, but my graduate students still struggle with this. And so I think in a way it gets folks thinking in a very deliberate way about the differences between graduate and undergraduate education. But we provide a lot of really useful service to the Office of Undergraduate Education, so we don't moonlight all that much.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think people often early on in the conversation realize that they are conflating graduate level and undergraduate level and faculty level, that they haven't really delineated what am I expecting of these different populations, and these conversations can help surface that. I want to make sure that people know that they can leave now.